Okay, I think we are successfully live. I think technology is serving us. So welcome. Thanks to Ken and Celia and Sadia and Shamal for joining us. And thanks to the folks who are watching via the live stream. So this conversation is more timely perhaps than we thought when we started it, which is to talk about conflict transformation. And what we're hoping to do in the next few minutes is introduce the concept. What does conflict transformation mean to folks? We'll give everyone a chance to introduce themselves, talk about who they are and how they come to this work. And we really want to try to ground this concept in a case study and in practice. So really try to move over the course of our conversation into something actionable that folks who are following along via the live stream can practice in their lives right now. So my goal is for this to happen. And we also invite the group gathered here to help co-create the agenda and take us where people feel called. Before we jump in, just a bit of context for those who are joining in live. I'm Brian Stout. I'm a middle child, network weaver, a mediator, father of two little kids based in Seattle. And I'm helping shepherd an emergent collaborative called Building Belonging. And we are an online home for people who are committed to building a world where everyone belongs. You can find more out about us at buildingbelonging.us. And to be clear, we're very much building the plane as we fly. So this is an emergent experience. We're trying to figure things out as we go and welcome others to help us do that. So one aspect of that work is curating a set of conversations that we're calling Conversations on Transformation. That is what we're doing today. And that's an effort to highlight different aspects of how change happens. So at the level of the self, society, interpersonal relationships and systems, what we think about as I, we, and world. And we think there's something powerful and transformative simply in the act of gathering in community as we are right now. And we recognize that it's a unique privilege to do that, to spend 90 minutes in shared practice online, especially in the middle of a set of intersecting crises that I don't think any of us have seen in our lifetimes quite in the way they're manifesting right now, that are exposing some of the deep injustice in our systems and our societies. And we are happy to welcome Sadia's children to this conversation as well. So we are committed to practice because this is a moment in which we are trying to offer these tools that we can actually use them out in the world, whether that's in conversations with friends and family or on the front lines with police. So for those of us here in the US and really for folks tuning in around the world, the last 2 weeks have been pretty brutal, a pretty visceral reminder that this question of belonging and of who belongs really does have high stakes for George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and so many others. So I know our speakers will touch on this a bit, but I wanted to share a quote here that has been resonating with me from Resmaa Menakem, who's a practitioner and expert on racialized trauma. And he says, quote, "While we see anger and violence in the streets of our country, the real battlefield is inside our bodies." So I've been thinking about that and trying to sit with that truth. And maybe the invitation before we dive in is to just take a breath together and collectively take a moment to reclaim the personal battlefield that is inside of us, to take a moment from all the things that are calling for our attention. So for folks here in the room and watching online, just invite everyone to take a deep, slow breath together. Think about who you're honoring and who you're holding in your mind as you do so. And maybe a second invitation here to think about your intention for this call, for these 80 minutes or so we're going to share together. Why are you here? What do you long for? And what might be possible if you had it? So another breath just to center into your intention for our time together. Thank you. So yeah, with that, we're going to dive in. It is an intense moment for everyone. And so I invite folks to bring whatever you're feeling here into the call, and we'll do our best to support each other through it. So we're going to start with introductions, invite folks to speak for maybe 3 minutes or so each. And the prompt is threefold. It's I am, my people are, and I belong to. Feel free to deviate from that prompt if you feel so called. So I think we'll start with Shamil and then move to Sadia, Ken, and Celia. Shamil.
Great. So I'm Shamil Idris. I'm dialing in from Washington, D.C., where I live with my wife and 2 daughters, 12 and 13. I am a peace builder, a father, an American, a Muslim, and privileged to be with you all today. My people, I grew up across. I'm the son of immigrants. My mother was born in Turkey and my father in Syria, and a very typical sort of story for a lot of immigrants. Their number one priority in raising my older brother and I was to get us to the best education system that they could, and that ended up being in New Canaan, Connecticut, which is a very privileged and wealthy part of this country, actually. So although I was born in New Jersey, when I was 7 years old, we moved to New Canaan, and I was raised there. And I think when I think about who my people are, I grew up across a lot of supposed dividing lines, not in any dramatic way, but we were the only Muslim family that I was aware of growing up in New Canaan. Every summer we would spend in Turkey in a town. It's now a small city, but it was a developing town, Düzce, in the north of the country, where almost my entire extended family lived in one big compound. Was fairly poor, certainly compared to New Canaan. So we would go back and forth every year. My first summer jobs were with the Ralph Nader's public interest research groups, going door to door, knocking on doors, getting signatures and donations, getting some doors slammed in my face. The culture on the PERGs was very young, very anti-corporate. Corporations were the enemy. And growing up in New Canaan, the parents of some of my best friends, of most of my friends, were the executives of some of the biggest corporations in the world. And then I went to Swarthmore College, which in many ways was much more diverse than New Canaan was, racially and socioeconomically. Bottom line was, looking back on it all now, I think that I felt a real affinity to people across a lot of dividing lines who sometimes had negative views of each other, across liberal, conservative, Muslim, Jewish, white, black, a lot of, societal dividing lines. And so I feel a belonging to each of those communities in a pretty profound way, because it wasn't just, gee, I appreciate and lecture their point of view. I have had deep and loving, respecting relationships across some of those societal divides from the youngest age. And so looking back now, I think it's why I feel like one of my primary communities is the peace building community.
Thank you. Sadia.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sadia Hamid. I am a mom, single mom at the moment, involuntarily, which is a whole nother story. I'm an immigrant. I'm a Muslim. I'm a woman of color. I'm often stuck between many different cultures and realities, and not always certain which part of myself is supposed to be coming forward. Depends on the environment and the ask and the action, I suppose. I'm a mom to 2 lovely kids who are growing up in America, a country that will be their home, but one that is posing some serious challenges based on their identity. I'm from Pakistan. That's where I grew up. My family did the interesting thing. I was born in London, and when I was 5, they moved me and my sister back because they wanted us to be closer to family and to know our heritage. And I got there at the end of General Zia's dictatorship, when he had changed the face of the country to Islamic law. And growing up there as a young girl and woman was a very interesting experience. And it was when I moved to Texas at the age of 16 that I actually fell in love with the United States Constitution, with the idea of democracy. And even though sometimes Texas gets a bit of a mixed reputation, the truth was that it was the first time that I ever realized that the democracy I had grown up in Pakistan, which was a very militarized and violent one, wasn't necessarily how it had to be. And that's where my journey really started for the last 25 plus years, it's really been about trying to understand that what are the ingredients in society that allow people to have voice, representation, agency, to be seen, to be heard. How do you wrestle with often very difficult histories that have wounded and marginalized people? What do you do if you belong to those groups, and what do you do if you don't? What's your responsibility? What does a collective social contract actually look like? My people are diverse. You know, I am South Asian, Pakistani. I have a huge family there. My husband's from Iran. He has a huge family there. I've grown up split almost evenly between 3 different countries and continents. My sister lives in Australia, where as far out as it gets. My human rights career has spanned the world. And so in my family, I include practitioners from all around the world that I have had the privilege and fortune to work with. And as far as an individual, I never understood until in recent years when people ask me the question, surely you aren't friends with a Republican or with a conservative, and I never understood that, because when I met somebody, I met them based on the person that they were to me and the relationship we forged. And actually, so many of my friends were in fact conservative leaning and had very different politics to me and came from different religions than me. It never mattered to the actual human bond and relationship that we forged. Which has always made me a big believer in looking beyond identity. And I come to this work in this space really through the lens of identity. What is identity? How much of it is constructed? How do we adopt it and own it? How do we sometimes reject it? What kind of a force does it play in the transformation of ourselves and our societies around us? You know, and I belong to the human rights and peace building community. But bigger than that, I just feel like I belong to the world. I think that we're much more similar than we are different. And I think that the more curious you are and the more you're willing to listen and be open, the more you realize that. And then your tribe becomes much bigger than smaller. And so that's where I find myself now at these very unique and I think opportune times in the country, but also, you know, in many parts of the world where we are seeing very similar trends and opportunities and also threats. And just a reminder that we're much more interconnected and also much stronger together. And so really come to this from a place of learning, cooperation, and strong belief in our collective ability to facilitate change in our own spaces and those that are very far from ours as well.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you so much. Lots of resonance already in the stories being shared. I appreciate that. Ken. Ken, I think you're still muted there.
Thank you. I think I would have answered these 3 questions, which are quite wonderful, in very different ways at different points in my life. And the difficulty is now how to construct an answer that encompasses all of those previous answers. But I think also we would, each of us, to some extent, answer these questions a little differently just 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago, 2 years ago. Today, I think we have to acknowledge that we are the people who are demonstrating and the people who have been beaten up on the streets. There's a wonderful poem by Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnamese Zen Buddhist monk, who says, I am the young woman who has been raped by the river pirate, and I am the river pirate. And I think what we learn in conflict resolution is that all roles are exist inside of us. And part of our job is to be in touch with them, to take seriously Walt Whitman's statement that I contain multitudes. And I think each of us do, but from my point of view, the 2 fundamental strains in my life experiences that have informed the work that I do, come first of all out of my parents. My father was a kind of WASP. His mother was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. His father was a military officer on behalf of the United States Empire in the Philippines and Hawaii and various other places around the world. My father rebelled and fought in Spain against Franco, was a part of the international brigades. My mother is Jewish. My father's parents rejected him because he married someone who is Jewish, and her parents rejected her because she married someone who wasn't. And the second part, I would say, is growing up, coming of age really in Berkeley in the 1960s. When I was very actively involved in all the political movements that took place then. I worked in the South in the civil rights movement, in South Georgia and Southern Alabama. I was a part of the anti-war movement, the peace movement in the United States, worked with GIs who were against the war, went to law school, became a lawyer for the anti-war movement, and was in charge of legal defense for all the major demonstrations that took place against the war during the 1960s. And so it was 15 years, full bore, intense activity. And a part of that was learning what transformation really consisted of, how difficult it was, how it looked into you. Nietzsche says, when you look into the abyss looks into you. And that's true with transformation as well. But the place where that really became clear was when I became a mediator 40 years ago. And I have been working in conflict resolution for the last 40 years, every day. I have mediated thousands and thousands of disputes. I started a group called Mediators Beyond Borders, and I've worked in about 25 countries around the world, including Pakistan and Turkey. Part of what I have learned in the course of that is that virtually anything that you do in conflict that is ranges all the way from listening to intervention is a kind of transformation. But that in addition to transformation, there is also transcendence. And what transcendence implies is learning. And the ability to learn from our conflicts and not repeat them, that contains a new element, that something that turns a circle into a spiral. And so that's been my fascination over the last several years. I've written about 15 books on conflict resolution, and I'm active today in working in Athens with Greek mediators who are trying to create dialogues between immigrants and Greek citizens. I'm working in the Middle East with a group called Combatants for Peace, which consists of former soldiers for the Israeli Defense Force, Hamas, Fatah, Islamic Jihad, etc., who are all trying to take a nonviolent approach to conflict resolution and a transformational approach that incorporates those into their societies. But here we are in the United States with confronting our own problems. And so what I'm concerned about now is how do we transform police-community relations? What do we learn from the pandemic? How do we deal with the various crises that we are facing now as a community, as a collaborative adventure rather than an adversarial one? So those are my points of focus now. I would say that on some level I belong to everybody. And also, of course, to my own particular circumstances, my own life, my own family, my own times.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like my connection with a lot of your work was from sort of international dimensions, and now all of us are kind of collectively retraining our energy back on the domestic, which is where Celia has her expertise.
Yeah, hi. Hello, fellow panelists and virtual world that is out there. My name's Celia Cutts, and when first asked this question, I immediately came to my mind was the thousands of organizers and activists that I've had the incredible honor and blessed experience to work alongside and with. And one of the hats I wear is as a trainer and facilitator in participatory education. And so have just been in the libraries and the church basements and the training rooms and the parks that we took over to be curious with each other about how to make the change that's necessary for the people who are in the room. And so right now I'm working a lot with organizers and activists who are either making demands on Mayor Jacob Fry in Minneapolis, or trying to figure out how to weave together a mutual aid network that was built for COVID-19 and is now adapting for this moment. So it's a bit of an interesting journey to be in specific conflict work, because I think my drive to conflict work came out of a need that was desperate to get met in the groups that I was working with. Because what we found was that while we would be aspirational and visionary and campaigning, we also started bumping heads with each other and replicating the systems we were trying to confront and dismantle and patterning them with each other. And so I've been in that world for about 10 to 15 years as an organizer and now a facilitator and trainer. And so those people are definitely my people. I've tried to get away. I've tried to choose to have some distance from that, and it just keeps pulling me back. So I have the wind carries me, and I allow it to carry me, and keeps carrying me back to the movement. So that's one hat that I wear. Another hat is my ancestors and my family. I was raised in Western New York in a very small town, similar to what has been said by other folks on the panel, Trump country. And the people whom my mom was breastfeeding next to voted for Trump in the last election and have been in deep dialogue about, so what? So why? What is that about? What are you visioning for this country that you think that this idea of a person represents? And being in that quality of the conversation, not that it's the individual, but it's the desire that we share for a sustainable world. And we have been informed that there's different paths to get there. And so maybe there's more information that needs to get shared, more news sources, more resources, more relationships that get bridged to help paint a just transition that I think everyone is craving and people have different answers for. So the region of Brockport, New York, on the Erie Canal, where I was raised, is a lot of agriculture, a lot of working class folks who are working in Kodak in Rochester, New York. And I was raised in a small business. And so I was kind of in the ways in which customer service forces you to get liked by a lot of people because it's about your economic survival, was definitely how I got acclimated to public relations and human interaction. And also I was the only Jewish family in my small town of Western New York. And so a lot of cultural teaching and communicating and educating to a predominantly white Protestant, white Catholic region. And so now as I'm in a space where I hold a dominant identity as a white person in multiracial spaces, I have a lived experience, not the same at all, and some approximation that I've been gifted to bridge and be able to be a resource that, I have economic security, I have physical health, and I have I receive a lot of privilege from the outside world. And so how do I know both experiences and all those experiences? I spent 8 years in Minneapolis, Minnesota, actually organized on the street corner where George Floyd was killed. And so I got politicized there in many ways, not only around Black liberation, but about my Jewish colonier identity in Palestine and being in relationship with Indigenous people in the Twin Cities. There's an amazing, strong population of Indigenous people in the Twin Cities, and got to be in relationship with folks in community and homes, and did some real unpacking of how I'd been sold an idea of liberation, whether that's in Israel or in this country, and had to really take a step back and notice what was going on for me and what lessons I was carrying into the worlds that I was in. So a lot of my community is also around Indigenous solidarity and Palestinian solidarity, and working with Jews to figure out what is the right relationship we have to our experience of, on this one hand, being persecuted historically, and on the other hand, having access to a lot of resources. And then I spent a lot of time in the streets. I was sort of, the WTO protests were some of my first moments of being in Seattle and being in Quebec City, and being a medic in the Twin Cities. And so I ran as a street medic for a couple of years, and just was really with people who were taking the risks of being in ranges of nonviolence. And that conversation is also a huge part of my consideration of what are the actions we take, and what's the story that gets told about them. Yeah, and the last thing I'll just say is there's a deep reverence for where I've come from, and a spiritual ancestry that I feel really accountable to, of not just my ancestors, but just my mom's family really struggling with the repression of women's power and women's voices and emotions. I have a lot of emotions. So my family, my people are emotional people who don't always think before we speak. And sometimes we make messes and then we clean them up, or we do our best. And so my ancestry were institutionalized for having strong feelings, and stigmatized for that. And so I have a lot of relationship and accountability to the path that helps us free the judgment from strong emotion, or from who we are in our cores and who we long to be. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
No, super beautifully said. Thank you for that. Yeah, I just, lots of common threads, I think, coming together here, and I feel like there's lots of depths we can get into. And I always like starting with introductions, because who we are is who we were and who we're trying to become. So I appreciate everyone sharing. The next prompt here is we're going to get into the concept, and the invitation is, what does conflict transformation mean to you? And then why is it important for transformation and liberation? So I think this time we're going to go Ken, and then Celia, and then Shamal, and then Sadia. And Sadia, if you want to jump in, if it's easier for where your kids are in life, feel free to raise your hand and we'll tap you in next. But yeah, maybe 3 minutes or so, kind of laying out what the concept means to you. Ken.
In order to understand what conflict transformation is, I think we have to understand what conflict is. And conflict is quite complex, but here are a couple of simple definitions. Number one, it's a place where there are two or more truths, each one of which believes it's the only one. Number two, pertinent to the COVID-19 experience, we can think of conflict as a lack of awareness of the imminence of death or sudden catastrophe. Because if we were aware of it, we would have our priorities straight, and we wouldn't be so caught up in the illusion that somehow the other one is wrong and we are right. Number three, conflict is the sound made by the cracks in a system, any system. An emotional system, an intellectual system, a family system, a social system, a political system. Number four, conflict is a lack of skill at being able to handle a particular kind of behavior. Number five, conflict is the voice of a new paradigm trying to be born. These are a few alternative definitions of conflict, and for each one of them, transformation has a different meaning. If we think of transformation as a change in the form of the conflict, then we can see that simply listening to the conflict is going to change its form. Fundamentally, I think we have to recognize that conflicts exist in 3 different places, and therefore there are 3 different locations that transformation occurs in. First, conflicts take place inside of us. Second, they take place between us. And third, they take place around us. That is, they are internal, they are relational, and they are systemic and environmental. And each one of those reveals a slightly different approach to transformation. And as I indicated before, transcendence, which is getting to a place where we have evolved to a higher order of conflict. So here's a different take on conflict. I think of this as the crossroads of conflict, which is the title of a book that I wrote. If we ask the question, not who gets into conflict, but who doesn't, here are 2 examples of 2 groups of people who do not get into conflict. 1, there are no 3-year-olds who experience conflicts over romantic love. Why? They're not ready yet. It isn't an issue. Doesn't arise, no conflicts. Number 2, there are no 60-year-olds who have conflicts with their parents over curfew. Why? Because they have, in theory, already solved that problem. So who gets conflicts? I think the answer is defined by a crossroads that takes place at the intersection of 2 fundamental forces. 1, a problem that we are now required to solve in order to learn and grow. And 2, a lack of skill at being able to handle that kind of problem. So every conflict in our lives is a kind of crossroads that is asking us to address some issue that we don't have the skills to be able to handle. But once we develop those skills, we evolve to a higher order of conflict. So if we think, for example, about nobody on this call gets into conflicts with kids on a playground over who gets to play with the toys, because we figured out how to handle it. We have a higher order of skill, which puts those conflicts behind us, essentially. Now, how many crossroads like this are there? Multiple. Here's the first one. Are we going to engage in our conflict and behave badly, or stop and try to figure out what's going on? Number 2, are we going to listen to what the other person has to say, or continue repeating what we believe or what happened to us? And et cetera, on into forgiveness and reconciliation. So the transformations don't end except with the development of a higher order of skill that then requires a different form of transformation. So I think we have to think of conflict as requiring continuous transformation, continuous learning, continuous evolution and adaptation, the continuous development of new sets of skills. So fundamentally, those take place, again, as I said, internally, inside of us, relationally, with others, and a part of every conflict is asks the question, who are you? What do you come to this conflict with? Another part asks, what is the self in relation to the other? And the third part is to look at the environment within which the conflicts take place, the systems that generate chronic conflicts, repeated conflicts, like the system of racism, the system of religious intolerance, gender inequality. These are sources of chronic conflict. And the final piece is, if we just think about this in relationship, for example, to slavery, what is the transformation that needs to take place in order to deal with the conflicts under slavery? Well, one is compromise, but that's not really transformational. All that does is it gets you to a slightly more civilized form of slavery. The only real transformation is the abolition of that relationship, because that relationship itself is a systemic source of chronic, ongoing conflict. And I think we are now facing crises that are forcing us into a transformational approach to social conflict, economic conflict, political conflict, conflicts over healthcare, and conflicts that are ecological and environmental. We're facing all 5 of these crises right now. And what we need to do is to recognize that they bleed into one another. So you can't tackle the political or economic crises so long as you continue to hold on to the social problem of the social divisions created by race and gender. It can't be done. We have to be able to somehow work on all 5 at the same time, and that's not going to be an easy task.
There's a lot there, and I like it. I think I'm teasing out the we world dimensions of change, the sort of iterative way transformation happens, and yeah, the notion of dealing with all of it at the same time. So easy stuff. Hopefully next 45 minutes or so we can knock that out. Celia.
Yeah, all right. So I think I get really curious about the transformation part of conflict transformation, and like what is the mechanisms by form. And I've done a fair amount of practice, personal practice and study and bring to my modality of like the body's wisdom, somatic, which is gaining huge popularity. And like, so what does it mean for new behaviors to be available for folks, and what's the process by which we like that's where I get really excited, and that's where it intersects with conflict for me. So I was thinking of like the ways in which healing is a part of conflict transformation in every single iteration that I ever want to be in. And so when I think of conflict transformation, I think, what is the thing that is keeping you from being in your own humanity and being in the humanity of the other? And what safety, what protection, what need do you need met to help that happen? And I think there's ways in which sometimes when I'm in spaces, it can get very big, it can get bigger than this moment in a way that isn't always accessible or helpful for the groups that I'm in. And so how do I think for me, conflict transformation does come down to the present moment that I'm with a group or with a person, and helping them build the inner skill set so that they become not only an individual with more access to grace, compassion, curiosity, generosity, righteousness, healthy anger, healthy rage, but also that they feel like they're in companionship and camaraderie with the group that they're with that is simultaneously building that skill set. So what are the spaces where there's legit skill building to be in ready response or like preventative care for conflict spaces? Because conflict is a natural occurrence, tension is going to exist. And I think there's also an overemphasis of and a judgment of conflict, that it's bad, that it's something that shouldn't exist. And my experience is that tension, dissonance, and there's scales of that, right? There's like incredibly violent conflict. And of course, I'm not advocating for that, but if we can slow down to a moment where people are in the room together, which is what we want and what we're all up to, what's possible here with these folks, so that they don't necessarily have to strive for a destination of quote unquote resolution, but they strive for what's true and possible here. And I think I've been a trained mediator and I've been in restorative justice practice also. And one of the things I'm grappling with and I'm practicing is that my experience is that a lot of dominant ways of resolving and managing tension privilege the need to control and subdue discomfort rather than build up our inner resiliency, legit physical capacity to hold more tension with curiosity and grace and skill. And that's about healing. That's about having a trauma resiliency practice. That's about having a systemic analysis that acknowledges internalized oppression and acknowledges the ways in which the systems of oppression are internalized by all of us to various degrees. And that when we repeat the systems that we're up against, what's up with that? Because then you're out of your integrity and you're out of your congruence. And so I want to be curious around what's happening that you are practicing a shape, a positionality that is your oppressor, that is the conflict of which you are trying to get free. And so to be in the curiosity of how are you out of your spirit's intention? How are you out of your soul's capacity here? Is something that's my practice. And I'm feeling a little like, how do you do that on a large scale? I don't know. And I don't know that I would that's not my question, you know, and I don't know that I have an answer for that, because it is so much in the moment when I'm with people. And that's where the practice is. So I get curious around like international bodies that try and do that, or larger scope, and how to do that to scale is a constant question that I'm in consideration of. And capacity building from an interpersonal to a group level, and then that group being conflict ready, and I don't even want to like alive, like resilient, having bandwidth, being able to be flexible. And I've been using a lot in my groups this concept of what's the way you repair? How do you recover from harm? It's not to avoid harm, it's to have harm feel a little bit less devastating so that you can be in recovery and resiliency and come back to the curiosity and the relationship that you're invested in, or let it go and have that be an okay option as well. I'll just say the last thing I'll say is I was with a group yesterday of young activists who are Quakers, and they were struggling with boundaries. How do I not just want to solve everything when you may not be in the right relationship? The people may not want to be in that room with you. And so we were talking around, how do you love somebody from where you are? How do you still believe that the thing you are offering can be of service, even if it's not getting picked up immediately from the person explicitly, but that you get to also love yourself and love the person from where they are. So I don't have bullet points, but that's my sharing for the question. Thanks.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. And thank you for starting to bring in some element of the practice. I feel like that is the work here, right? Like building that individual and collective skill set. Yeah, and even raising that question of scale, which is a thing that I think sits over all of us, like as we recognize that these challenges are global. So Shamal, since you work globally, maybe you can solve that one for us. No pressure.
Right, sure. No, I really enjoyed listening to Ken and Celia, and looking forward to Sadia's views on this. I didn't mention it at the outset, but in my professional life, I'm the CEO of Search for Common Ground, and this is a global peace building organization with about a little over 900 full-time staff and a lot more volunteers and partners. We work in 28 countries, and whenever I'm asked to speak on subjects, I feel very much the responsibility and also the privilege of kind of representing. And I think, Celia, you kind of gave, each person gave voice a little bit to that humbling position that you get into when you're representing a much broader community. Our teams around the world work very much at the forefront, both of interpersonal, but also systemic change. And we have some views on what systemic change looks like, which I'd love to get into. But going to the core of the question, we view conflict not only as a natural thing, but actually a welcome thing. That conflict is the natural friction that you get when differences come into contact with one another. Those can be different religious ideologies, different perspectives about how a problem should be solved. It could be around different races and the baggage that might bring depending on the community that you're in. And so for us, the conflict can very much lead to, if it's handled poorly, polarization, or in the worst case, violence. But conflict can also lead to the most creative and sustainable solutions. And the process by which that happens is really, in our view, is the heart of conflict transformation, is transforming conflict into cooperation. And I think at the heart of that is understanding two things. One is that there are a couple of ways, there are probably a million ways you can drive change, but there's sort of two dominant ways you can drive change. There's an adversarial approach where you take an issue you really care about, you identify your allies on that issue, you identify your opponents on that issue, and then you go to war, literally or figuratively. And this is how a lot of change gets driven in our politics. And oftentimes in that approach, the issue you're debating about might not even become central. You might spend your time delegitimizing the other side, whatever it might be. And adversarial approaches, in our view, have become too dominant. And I think even a lot of wonderful and noble causes have been advanced largely through adversarial approaches. I think the human rights field is steeped in a lot of adversarial approaches, some of which I totally understand and are actually fine. I just think we're over-invested in them. I think the other approach to driving change is a collaborative approach, which starts from the same point. You take an issue you truly care about, but the next step is to identify everyone who will be affected by how that issue plays out, and then to work very hard to build relationships across all of those old-fashioned terms, stakeholders, so that they together can try to craft solutions that uphold the dignity of all and meet the interests of all. And that kind of a process is really what brings about the second main component to conflict transformation that I want to highlight, which is simply that transformation, in my view, is both a combination of addressing the issue at hand and building and strengthening the relationships involved in that issue, and that it doesn't sublimate the relationships to the issue. So it's not, I believe so strongly in this issue, therefore I'm willing to demean Ken or Celia, whoever who doesn't agree with me, but that the process of building that stronger relationship, respecting the dignity of every person, caring genuinely and wanting to meet their human needs is one and the same as trying to tackle this policy issue or this problem in our society that is affecting us both or affecting us all. And so the elements of conflict transformation, to sum up for me, that are really critical are that conflict is not only, conflict is natural, violence is not. And that the key then is kind of how we deal with conflict, and we can deal with it in a way that transforms both the relationship and overcomes the issue, or in ways that that can sublimate one to the other. And so I'll just leave it there. I think this issue of scale is something I'd love to get into, but I don't want to take any more time.
Yeah, resonating with all of that, and I'm liking a lot of common themes here around the relationship among the different dimensions of conflict and the notion that we're trying to recenter relationship. There's an element of repair that I heard coming out in Celia and Ken as well. Sadia, what does conflict transformation mean to you?
So sort of separating the terms a little bit, like to start off with the term of conflict, like agreeing with a lot of what's been said before, which I see it certainly as an agent of change, like a natural occurrence in the human experience. And especially when we're living in communities and societies and not isolated in and of ourselves. And even though I've worked on preventing and resolving violent conflict for many, many years, conflict inherently does not need to be violent and is often not violent, but I do believe that it almost always has the power to be catalytic. The question is catalytic for what? And how do you actually lean into or hold the space for moments of conflict in ways that you can catalyze change and transformation in a way that allows you to create more positive impact? And often through the course of thinking about conflict and how that plays out in nonviolent ways, I hear people talk about 3Ds, and that is usually the ability to dissent, the ability to engage in constructive debate, and the ability to have disagreement. We don't always have to agree on everything. That is not necessarily the fundamental of how we can coexist in an inclusive or just society. Having space for disagreement and difference of opinion, different perspective, different worldview, I think is actually incredibly important, also part of the human experience. And so I like to call those things out because I think that there's a sense of discomfort in this idea of difference or disagreement. And that often then leads you to move conflict into a completely negative space, and also its association with usually being violent. Though I often think that's not the case, that in fact violent conflict is a very small proportion of the conflict that you will experience in your lifetime. I think that conflict is actually something that you're experiencing every day, and when you become a parent, you realize that you're constructively trying to defray conflict on a regular basis, sometimes more successfully than not. I also think that when we're talking about conflict in a societal context, it makes me question what's the current status quo, right? What's the landscape? What's the history? What's this moment in time? Where is this conflict existing? And I think that oftentimes people can see it in two different ways. So one can be conflict in the sense that you have a top-down desire to maintain a status quo. Even if that status quo is only benefiting fewer people in society, or perhaps and is not in fact benefiting more people. You can think of that in the way in which we see, you know, all kinds of systems that are enforced, you know, from rule of law all the way through to healthcare and, you know, and other systems. And then you can also see a shift in the status quo that comes the other way, when people are actually fed up of or rejecting the status quo, or feeling the agency to decide if they can try and change the status quo. And so then you can see conflict arise that way. And you can see that through social movements. You see that through the way people go out and vote in countries where they have the ability to do so, or who are asking for the right to vote in places where they don't. You also see that, you know, through consumer behavior. I mean, there's so many different ways in which you can actually be trying to catalyze and engage in change through individual and collective agency, that I consider to be moments of conflict, but they're not violent conflict. They are, however, trying to change, challenge, transform a status quo. And I think that identity overlayers in all of these things: racial, religious, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation. I mean, the list goes on. And so then when you're looking at your position in the status quo, there's a question of, are you on the benefiting side of the status quo or not? If you have a certain identity, so me as a woman of color, an immigrant Muslim woman in America, how much am I going to assimilate in order to avoid conflict and allow the status quo to benefit me? How much am I going to resist that? Because I actually think that maybe assimilation leads to something that, you know, is a slippery slope towards then not benefiting, right? Or perhaps putting the future of my own children, their agency, their voice, their rights, at greater risk of being equally recognized or welcomed or included in society. And I think that as you move through your life, you're always making these decisions, and it changes constantly. So we've talked about change, iteration as a part of transformation. And I think that that's true. I don't think that we're ever static. I think we're all constantly transforming, which means there's a lot going on at any given moment in time. And that's why I think that conflict is so catalytic, because you've got so many people who are transforming and making those decisions collectively, but also individually at any given time. And then, you know, when you're looking at the idea of conflict, like, I mean, obviously the other side to that is the popularly used word peace. And, you know, we won't get into a debate about the term peace right now. But what I want to just pose is, when we talk about peace, I always have this question of whose peace are you talking about? So let's take the racial justice protests that we're seeing across the United States right now, sparked off in Minnesota after the death in custody of George Floyd. And this call in the wake of the protest, where some turned violent, and we're still trying to understand the dynamics of that violence, who was involved, how, etc. But let's put that aside. Like, in the face of that, these calls of, we must return to peace. And individually, I rejected that call, not because I'm in favor of violence, but because that call didn't answer the question of who was at peace in the first place. For an African-American man like George Floyd to have survived the coronavirus and met his death in police custody over what we know was an alleged nonviolent crime, as far as we understand it, and again, we can, you know, put that to one side, makes me feel like perhaps he never knew peace. Did he know peace? Did his family know peace? Did that community know peace? What kind of peace are we talking about? And so I think we also have to be very careful when we're looking at these kinds of moments and looking at the interplay of conflict in society and the idea of transformation. Is, what are you trying to get to at the end? Where are people starting? And actually, I often don't like to use the term returning back to anything, but only forging forward to something better. And what is that new vision? Can we be iterating and catalyzing change forwards, rather than this idea of wanting to return to something? I think that there's multiple layers of conflict transformation that are happening constantly. And I think that the way we show up in different moments of conflict, and how we choose to be transformed, to help transform or not, to not want to transform, is very different. And so it's almost like you're looking at many different spheres that are orbiting constantly, right? And it's happening all the time. So you can look at that with you as an individual, the conflicts that we are probably all coming up against within our own selves. Who am I? How do I stand up in this time? What do I do? You know, should I not, right? There's always that happening, your own internal conflict. Who are you in this moment? Who do you want to be? What does that mean? Your family, right? Which is a whole nother dimension of like, you know, keeping the peace. What does that mean? What type of conflict, right? How do you navigate that? Then you move into your community, then you move into your society, then you move into your country or your nation, and then you move into the world. And if you think about the fact that we are constantly engaging in this kind of conflict transformation every day at all of those levels, you take a step back, right? You realize that it's actually an awe-striking, but also incredibly complicated landscape. And that we are constantly evolving as individuals as we're moving through that. And so I often, you know, even though it gets messy and uncomfortable, like to encourage people to lean into messiness, to lean into discomfort, to lean into complexity, rather than trying to simplify, rather than trying to bring things down to a common denominator, because of the fact that in reality, the landscapes that we're working in we exist in that very, I think, messy, complicated space almost all the time. And so for me, I look at conflict transformation like from that biggest picture of sort of, you know, atrocity prevention, genocide prevention, violent conflict, international armed conflict, all the way down to how then you funnel that down for every individual until you reach the point where you're looking at the family unit or the individual, and that understanding that that chain reaction is constantly in motion. And therefore, when you're looking at moments where you can catalyze change through conflict in society, you want to be aware of how people are able to show up and actually make full use of that, but that everyone is moving back and forth in that continuum constantly.
Yeah, I love all of that, and I want to bring in a comment from the live chat and also create a space for you all to respond to what each other is saying here. So the themes that are kind of standing out to me, I guess what I'm trying to remember here is a lot of what this group takes for granted and is speaking to with confidence is fairly radical, right, out there in the world, which is conflict is good and indeed necessary, right? It's about relationship and repair, not problem solving or resolution. Even this notion that, you know, I think all of you spoke to some dimension of, it's at all levels, right? I, we, world at the same time, right? And we are yo-yoing between those. And you also called out that it's about all of our identities, right? Not my professional identity and my parental identity, but yeah, yes, and. So I'm appreciating that there's a lot of wisdom being offered here that I think flies in the face of what is dominant culture wisdom. So an invitation to each of you to, if there's something that you feel called to speak to, feel free to chime in. And before we turn to the practice question, I really do want to try to ground this in something concrete for folks. I'll bring a question from the live stream, but if there's a place you're feeling called, please jump in. Yeah, Ken.
Yeah, a couple of things. One is Celia raised the issue of scale. And I think that it's important. I've been struggling with this for several years now, looking for how to take what I do in mediations between family members or divorcing couples or husbands and wives or whoever they might happen to be, and figure out how do we turn that into useful technique at a large scale. And I think that conflict is fractally organized, meaning organized in a scale-free way, that there is something self-similar on all scales that unites what happens between two kids on a playground with what happens between the heads of nation states. And that fundamentally is the neurophysiology of conflict. It's how we respond, and we have some understanding of this. And there's some really wonderful research taking place in Geneva right now, funded by the EU, which is looking at what happens to your brain on conflict and what happens to people's brains in mediation. And this doesn't mean that there's a one-to-one correspondence between something that you would do between neighbors, for example, and something that you would do between social movements. but oftentimes there is. So for example, I worked with a very large, very well-known international environmental organization, activist organization, in which the international organization and the US organization were at odds with one another. And what I used was a technique that I developed in the course of all this mediation practice, which is how do you transform a conflict story? And how do you transform not just a story, which is about something that happened, but a conflict narrative, which is about who did it. It's about those people. And what I did was I interviewed people on both sides and got them to tell me a little something about what they thought of people on the other side. And then I gave each side all the information about what the other side said about them. And then we talked a little bit about conflict stories and narratives. How are they structured? And the fundamental way in which they are structured is this. Every conflict story takes the form of an accusation. But if you accuse someone of something, all that you get in response is defense and counterattack. Beneath every accusation is a confession, meaning an indication of what it means to you. And beneath every confession is a request. So the assignment for each group was to take all the things the other group said about them and ask the question, what is the confession underneath these accusations and what's the request? And what could we do to satisfy the underlying interests that are represented in that story? And to do it in a way that nobody will ever tell that story again. And this is a transformational experience for the people who did this. That's an example of taking something at a small scale and turning it into something that works on a large scale. The second thing has to do with the 3 Ds. And I noticed that there were 2 Ds that for me were missing. One was the D of diversity. And the second is the D of dialogue. Not just debate, but dialogue, which I think is fundamentally different. And the last piece is about peacemaking itself. And what do we mean by peace? And I think this is a great question. I think it was Tacitus who said they create a desert and call it peace, about the Roman policy of just sort of killing everything in sight and then calling it peace. And my experience from, again, the movements of the 1960s was that what calls for peace meant was calls for silence. And that those can't mean the same thing. So if we complexify peace building, if we understand actually, as I think everybody on this call recognizes, that if there is no justice, there can be no peace. But in addition, a little bit more problematically and subtly, if there is no peace, there cannot be justice. Now, what that means is, it goes back to your point, Brian, about the adversarial, and Shamil's point about the adversarial versus collaborative approaches to problem solving. And so what we have to really do is to take, for example, I've had a lot of experience, and other mediators have had a lot of experience doing what is often called large group, multi-stakeholder consensus building processes, public policy dispute resolution. And these are automatically large group types of conversations. And we have some knowledge about how to do convening, about how to break people up into small groups and design questions that will be helpful in doing this. And then I think that what we can see is, as a final piece of this, is that what we're looking for is courageous conversation. What we are looking for is a kind of combination, creative combination of difference, disagreement, debate, dissent, and diversity and dialogue.
Mm, I love that. Yeah. And I think it's maybe a nice tie into this theme that Sadia brought up that's coming back around. What does peace mean? And Celia, I don't know if we want to chime in on that. It seems like there's a thread there.
Yeah, I was just feeling very moved by some of what I heard Sadia say, and I think there's some resonance here, and the ways in which peace for whom, and that my experience is that peace is often also a tactic of silencing and assimilation into a norm that is, whether that's because of whiteness or capitalism or sort of the status quo, and that I'm just looking for what I wrote in the chat because there's multiple conversations happening right now, but that like, it's also like an assimilation process for folks. I mean, Sadia said it already. And so I think there's a way in which I get really heated about when peace becomes a project that is funded by a imperialist project that wants to spread a methodology across the world. For what purpose? To hold an identity of a global superpower. And so it gets so big so fast that we get out of relationship with each other. We get out of the ability to actually be authentic and be humble and like watch when we're defensive, and it compounds with job security and rank and role and ego. And when it gets so into a project of a moral hierarchy, it's very challenging to get curious around where you may be clueless, or where you may be wrong, or where you may be have been swallowed a pill that perpetuated a dominant narrative. And appreciating this question that I think is in the live chat around how do you surface? I think the assumption is that there's always conflict. There's actually always tension. And so if you aren't seeing it, you aren't seeing something. And how do you get wondering about what is silence? Silence is not consent. Silence doesn't necessarily mean that people are in agreement. People just going along can't be assumed that means they're doing it because they are 100% behind it. There's so many reasons why people go along: for keeping their jobs, for keeping their relationships, for keeping the quote unquote peace, which has kept a dominant narrative and a dominant oppressive dynamic in this country and across the world for 400 plus years. So I think I get wondering about what is the skill set to what else? I'm not going to believe this calm, this peace, this thing, because I know, George Floyd is not the first or last Black man who will get killed by the police. And a lot of people have known that for a long time, and a lot of people haven't. And if you don't know that, then welcome. And how do you know how long it's been happening and go back and find out what you haven't known for so long? And do that from a place of curiosity and humbleness, because I was raised on public education with textbooks that left a lot of history out. And I'm so grateful that I've gotten a bigger worldview of what's true so that I can be more honest about who I am. It's a much freer world that way. So
I wonder if I can invite you into a bit of a practice that I found helpful that you introduced me to, and we'll bring Sadia in here in a second. My introduction to your work was a podcast you did on leading conflict from the feminine.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there are practices you found, to the question you're just speaking to from the live chat around how do we surface what is subterranean and not yet sort of at the level of visible conflict, but is lurking. The commenter asked about dissonance. And I wonder if there's a practice that you might have either now, or maybe you can offer it later if you'd like to think about it for a second.
Yeah,
and how to sort of surface and call that out.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I'd love to make space for others on the panel, but it's a concept, interdiversity and or mapping. So if I find myself in a moment, how do I take pen to paper, I literally make a drawing and I map out what are the wide range of emotions that I'm having right now, and actually honor the parts of me that are not nice, are dissonance, are frustrated, are, excuse my language, fucking pissed off about whatever is going on, and wonder why I feel that way. Rather than push it away as something that's not welcome, love that part of me, because that part of me is seeing something that is true that I may be afraid of, but I know there is so much resource out there to build bravery, to be in relationship with that huge inner diversity of the ways we actually are, and express to survive, to stay welcome by dominant narratives. So the podcast has a legit like walk through this mapping process, but I did it this morning for a group. Like, I'm feeling like it's too quiet here, and I'm also enjoying the peace. So what's up with that?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that in. Sadia,
Yeah.
do you want to chime in?
Yes. So with the question from the live chat, I mean, following on from what Celia was saying, I can understand how also to people this idea that conflict is ever present, and so you're living in conflict also feels awful, right? If you understand that in the way in which we have often talked about or perceive conflict, that doesn't sound like a wonderful life choice necessarily. And so I think that it's also about being able to move through the layers of that. And so when you sense conflict, sometimes that comes out in a sense of anger, rage, frustration, whatever that might be. Hopefully you're trying to find a constructive channel to that. Underneath that, and often the reason why sometimes the conflict stays subterranean is because it is also often cloaked in pain. And pain is one of the things that can feel really difficult to lean into. It's usually filled with trauma. If it is coming up from a previous trauma, there's this idea of not wanting to re-experience that again. But pain to me, and being able to lean into pain and then using what emotions come from understanding that pain, is one of the most catalytic things someone can do to help transform conflict in a positive way, internally, within your family, within society. But it is a feeling where you have to allow yourself or feel safe to be vulnerable, right? To be exposed, to allow yourself to go there. And I think that is often something that is quite missing. And so you can move to the anger, the rage, and the frustration faster and fuel that without ever getting to the pain, because the ability to be vulnerable and safe in that vulnerability doesn't necessarily exist. You don't have the support to move through and transmute the trauma into something that actually can help you evolve and then help those around you use that experience to evolve as well. I also think that there's a really big difference between peace and peacefulness. And so to me, peace is not the absence of conflict. I think you can have conflict and still exist in peacefulness, in a sense of being able to find calm purpose amidst whatever conflict might be experienced around you. And again, that has to do with the space for healing, for mindfulness, for groundedness, for a sense of purpose, presence, agency, voice, being seen, being heard. But that I think that those things are distinct, and a more nuanced conversation would allow us to draw those out. And as far as practice goes, I mean, I think that for me, there are fundamental questions that I find myself asking myself in any given moment, and that I see practitioners, peers, friends, family members also doing. And so let's just take this moment of racial justice, Black Lives Matter protests around the country, also interlayered with COVID-19 and all the complexities that brings out around inequity, lack of inclusion, injustice. Often I find myself asking a series of questions. Who am I in this moment? And the answer to who am I in this moment needs to be a holistic answer. And the next question might be, what is my work in this moment? And the who am I and what is my work are not necessarily the same, because we're not a job description. I'm not just a mother. I'm not just the leader of a nonprofit. I'm not just an immigrant. I am a sum total of things. And then maybe within that, I have a piece of it that I actually work on. But there's a whole nother experience to that I'm going to bring to the table. I think, as Celia mentioned, it's really important to ask yourself how those are different and how you feel about that. How do you feel about those levels? How are they different? How do you feel about the fact that they're different? Because that's going to help you answer the question of how you can show up and who you're showing up as, in those spaces. And it is those things help you understand how you're feeling. And then, for people who feel compelled to act or feel paralyzed to act or aren't sure what to do, there's a question of, is it okay to follow? When can I follow? When is it safe to follow? When can I lead? Should I lead? Is it appropriate to lead? Because it doesn't always have to be either or. Am I listening? How much am I listening? Do I want to say something? What is it I want to say? Is it my turn to actually be the one to say? Or is it my turn to hold a space so others can say? Sorry, give me 1 second, love. So those are sort of some of the things that I think I move through quite consistently, and also ask others to move through as well. And now my daughter has a question, so pardon me.
Sounds like someone else thinks it's her turn. I appreciate that. Shamal, anything you want to add to this? I think we're starting to tiptoe into practice here.
Yeah. Well, I guess on the specific question around scale, you know, we a couple years ago we looked at. So we've been working since 1982, and a couple years we looked at where were the places where we felt we had played some role, some catalytic role in a change that then sustained and/or grew after we stopped engaging, or after sort of international actors stopped supporting financially that work. And there were more than 40 examples, and we kind of teased them through, and when we worked hard on this, and without going through all the details, what we saw is that in order to drive what we call enduring change, which is, you know, it sustains or even grows without reliance on external intervention or external financial support. All of the examples we came upon fell into one of three categories. They either reflected a change in institutions, a change in social norms, or a change in markets. That either, police department had adopted a community policing initiative, or a syndicate of radio outlets had adopted a new approach or policy towards covering issues so that they didn't incite violence. That's an institutional change. Or a change in how a critical mass of the population talks about and deals with its differences. There were a lot of examples where new language had actually become popularized, and 20 years later is still being used that didn't exist before a particular intervention, or where there was a rise of a local market. A market has supply, demand, and capital, and that, in short, local financial resources were resourcing what those of us in this room might call a conflict transformation or peace building approach, right? Even if that's not what would be called locally. And each of those three forms of enduring change, when we then looked at, okay, you know, how long does it take to drive change at that level? You know, how long did it, and I remember asking, he's now our Asia regional director, but he was a Nepalese youth leader for many years before he played a real leadership role in over time in getting the police department there to adopt a community policing initiative. I sort of asked him directly, Raj, from the day you walked in and just tried to get the chief of police to take you seriously, to here's a community policing policy that's completely rolled out. They don't credit us. They don't turn to us. They own it. Population owns it. You know, are they proud of it? How long did that take? And of those 40 or so cases, not all of them, but the vast majority of them fell in the 8 to 10 year range, where you can generate. And it's interesting because we're not, you know, the scholarship. If you read Jean-Paul Lederach saying you can't measure true results in our field in anything less than 10-year increments. You know, our findings came directly out of frontline practice. It wasn't sort of looking at Lederach, but it very much mirrored what he said, which doesn't mean you can't generate results sooner. You can resolve disputes certainly faster than that. You can generate, but in terms of systemic change, where either there's a change in institutional policy or behavior, a change in social norms, or a new local market has arisen to resource a peace building approach, at least with our methodology, it was about an 8 to 10 year process. And then we looked at kind of what does it take to do that. And it's you know, at least again, with our methodology, it's working both top down and bottom up. You know, it's not all about leadership or all about the grassroots. It's, you know, especially in today's world, it's kind of all about all of it. And you know, happy to talk through kind of what the key steps in the methodology are, you know, but I know that elements of that methodology would find resonance and direct corollaries in the interpersonal or even the internal that a lot of us that we're talking about a lot today. Not always a one-to-one match all the way through. But the last thing I would say is I think there's a lot, we could go into the whole thing that I think, Celia, you were putting on the table around the institutionalization of peace building and what has that done, and where's the funding coming from for our field and what has that done. I don't know, Brian, if you want to take things in that direction, but I think to me there too, there are a couple really fascinating elements of that story. If you look at what's happened to international conflict since 1950 until today, and where we are at this pivot point, this transition point between one world order, you know, an international system, and whatever's going to come next. But that's a whole different, I don't know if you want to go there, but I'm happy to get into that.
I'm loving this, and I appreciate it. I guess, I mean, maybe to tie some of that together, because I think there's a theme here around scale that I think a lot of us are grappling towards, and I think some of the folks following along are, calling from other time zones, other countries, other continents. And there's also a recognition, I think, that it does require intervention and transformation at every level, right? Individual, interpersonal, and societal, systemic. And I think there's a collective grappling with what that looks like. And I think part of the way I've been processing this moment with George Floyd and sort of the reemergence of Black Lives Matter as a global phenomenon is trying to understand what's different about this moment. And I don't pretend to have an answer, but I think part of what it is the fact that, everyone in this call, but all the organizations and networks you're part of exist in a way that they didn't just a few years ago. I mean, thinking about the work that Training for Change, which is Celia's organization, didn't exist a while ago. And now there's lots of people out there who are more skilled. I mean, I think Ken opened this conversation by talking about building that muscle. People have more skill in staying centered and sort of, we haven't talked about our vagal nerve yet, but how do we avoid getting triggered in the face of trauma and sort of reconnecting with ourselves? So I guess maybe we've got 5 minutes. I want to have an opportunity for folks to close with whatever feels like a parting thought you'd like to make. So the broad invitation is whatever you'd like to share as we close here. The more specific invitation is what gives you hope in collectivizing this transformation? If we're talking about conflict transformation at multiple levels, are there trends, networks, communities of practice that you're part of right now that you see, yeah, this is happening. This feels like, maybe we can't quantify it, but yeah, sources of hope that this is taking root at a more systemic level. Maybe we'll let whoever wants to chime in speak, and then maybe pass the mic to whoever is next to you on the screen.
Okay. I guess there are several things that that give me hope. One word that we haven't used here today is the word culture. But a part of what we're trying to change in relationship to racism is a culture. And what's interesting about culture is that it isn't fixed. And that people, by sort of shifting the kinds of questions that they ask, the kinds of answers that they give, by looking into themselves in the ways that have been described on this call, can actually transform culture in pretty dramatic ways. So my base of experience comes from working in the South in the civil rights movement when Black men were murdered every day and nobody did or said anything. There was that kind of silence that Celia described. When we could murder people in Vietnam and nobody would say anything. And what gives me hope is the fact that people are speaking up courageously and connecting with each other on a much, much broader scale. I think underneath the surface, we have been united by a realization that what we thought we had achieved, we hadn't achieved at all. That there is really nothing that we can take for granted. There is no liberated territory except inside of us together. We are now fast approaching the most important election in my history, possibly the most important election in the history of the country, arguably the most important election in the history of the planet. And I think that there is an awareness that everything is about to pivot around this moment, and that we are building towards that moment when a pivot needs to happen. The pivot won't be enough. We will have work to do in making these things real. But I think that what we are being called upon to identify now for the first time through a set of questions is what is possible in police-community relations that we haven't thought of before. So it is possible for all police everywhere to be trained in nonviolent communication, collaborative negotiation, public dialogue facilitation, restorative justice techniques, and to mediate disputes rather than assume that violence is the only method for solving problems. It's possible for us to imagine police in cities apologizing for racial discrimination, failing to listen to and negotiate with demonstrators and minority communities. It is possible to invite communities, entire communities, into facilitated dialogues on police community relations, to invite people to make recommendations for change. These are all conflict resolution techniques that make it possible for us to take the emerging conflicts that are taking place within our community over defunding the police or abolishing the police to an entirely different level by imagining what kind of relationship we want to have. But here I wrote a book which is called Politics, Dialogue, and the Evolution of Democracy. And what it argues basically is that there are power-based forms of democracy, rights-based forms, and interest-based forms. And that what we are now attempting to do is to transition from a power or rights-based form into an interest-based form of democracy. So under autocracy, or an autocratic form of democracy, the only skills you require are to know how to keep silent, how to obey orders, how to not get involved. In a procedural democracy, a rights-based democracy, you need to be able to vote yes or no, up or down, for this candidate or that candidate. And that's what debates fundamentally take us to. But dialogue is different. And an interest-based form of democracy asks us to think together, as we have done in this conversation, about what we want and why it's important to us and what difference it makes to each of us and to all of us. So I would say that, yes.
I know we're almost out of time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I know that I had a couple things to say, and I'm curious about other folks, and I'm
Oh, you're
just
right.
want to make sure we all get a chance to.
Yes, please.
Is that okay? Okay.
Absolutely.
Sorry. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll be very brief. I think one of the things that COVID-19 for me has woken more people up to is interdependence, and the mutual aid networks that came out of the necessity because of government failings are now embodying people to realize that we are the ones that make things happen and that we have to be in dialogue. And so there's so many people's platforms that are coming up through local governments, whether that's through the Minneapolis City Council. Maybe that'll happen. It means that the people have to keep our politicians or people in power at the forefront. There's a current vote right now for the West Virginia governor's race and there's a brilliant people's platform for Stephen Smith, sorry. And so I think there's just a both and of we have to be in relationship with the access to resources that we have and be in practice with each other in community and stop relying on elected officials to get our work done when it means that we are the people who make it. It's a people's population. And so I think COVID required us to be in mutual solidarity and in resource to each other in a way that I'm curious about how those networks are evolving and iterating and generating. That gives me hope.
Thank you. Sadia or Shama, last thoughts?
Do you want to go ahead, Shama?
Sure. I'll just say, I think the fact that the protests are growing and not dissipating, I think the size and diversity of the participants, and I don't mean just racial diversity, although that too, I don't remember a time in my lifetime when I saw so many police spontaneously speak out publicly on every social media platform. And this was before it was sort of the thing to do, within 48 hours before the police officers were arrested or charged, saying not only is this unacceptable, but these people need to be arrested and prosecuted. It was not hearing police say that. I think even symbolic moves, which I know a lot of people kind of brush aside because we need a lot more than symbolism. But for Black Lives Matter to go for something that less than 2 years ago sort of was an FBI report around Black identity extremism to something that's now painted in the nation's capital large enough for everyone, basically free to see from outer space. I think these are important symbols. I think the thing that gives me the most hope probably though is is the leadership, particularly from young people and from women. And most of the movements for social change that you see that are really powerful over time are instigated by young people and have heavier representation and leadership from women. And we're seeing that in a way now that I think is even stronger than what we've seen in the past. So I actually am without wanting to undersell the daunting nature of the task before us, I'm feeling more hopeful now, honestly, than I have maybe any time in my lifetime that some things will structurally change.
Thanks, Amal. Sadia, last thoughts?
I think that one of the most important things and what gives me hope is the fact that none of us are islands. And, you know, through having the privilege of working with activist movements around the world, what I often know is that many times people are propelled to become an activist because there's something, you know, that you hit a moment where you're just like, I need to do something. And I think we're seeing that across the US. I think we've seen it many times before in many other countries around the world. I mean, we've seen it in Sudan that brought about, you know, change that we, you know, dreamed of for decades. And I think that in that moment, it can be overwhelming when you know you want to do something, but you're not quite sure how to. And I think that for me, over the last few years, the community of practice that my organization has helped to build is really about how you connect that learning. How do we learn from one another and bring those lessons to one another so you don't feel alone? So you have a peer network that you can go to in a very open, safe way so that you can iterate but not have to reinvent the wheel, and sort of how we do that collectively. And so we've brought so many lessons from Kenya to the United States in the last few weeks and months around what it looks like to be at a risk of political violence, what it means when demonstrations turn violent, what it happens when small businesses lose and the community realizes it's loses. Okay, can you give me a second?
I'll watch your TV.
Okay, you can watch TV when I finish this conversation, okay? So I think that's what gives me hope, like a sense that we're united across countries, that we have a lot to learn, and that there's an openness to learning and iterating and being in it together as like a shared outcome, rather than a sense of only one or somehow this idea previously held that someone wins, someone loses. I think this is, if we're silent, we all lose. And if we come together, we all have more opportunity and hope. So yes.
And offering us a live practice and conflict transformation with the well, thank you all so much to everyone here on the call, and thanks to the folks who are joining live. I'm dropping some resources in the chat with links for the speakers here. Our next session, if folks want to join, is actually on reconnecting with the sacred. This notion of how do we bring alternative sources of knowledge. We talked here about our bodies and symbolism. This is to take that conversation a little bit deeper. So folks are invited to that. I'm going to stop the live stream now.
So my son's favorite thing to do is to hang up.